Konnichiwa. Today, we're going to drill a bit deeper into some areas of Japanese structure. I'm going to look at some aspects of the de particle that we haven't looked at so far, and in order to do that, we're going to have to look at some new structural concepts that we haven't considered up to this point. We haven't considered them partly because you can get quite a long way in elementary Japanese without knowing them, but as we get into more complex areas, it's a good idea to have these tools in our toolbox. So, let's get started. As I've said before, almost all Japanese words divide into three kinds, that is, nouns, verbs, and adjectives. There are a few words that are outside these three, but not a great number. Most of the things that aren't verbs and adjectives, in fact, turn out to be nouns. However, there's another way of dividing Japanese words which is used in Japanese grammar, and that is into taigen and yogen, which literally means body words and use words, but the terms I'm going to employ is static words or static elements and active words or active elements. Now, static or body words essentially boil down to nouns. So, in a way, this underlines the noun-centered structure of Japanese because we divide them into nouns and the rest, the other two. And it's very easy to see how this works. By active words, what we mean is those words that can transform, that can modify, and that applies to both adjectives and verbs. And in fact, they transform in very much the same way. In both cases, the thing that transforms is always the last kana of the word. And we know that both verbs and adjectives must always end in a kana. They can't be all kanji, otherwise they'd be nouns. All verbs end in an uro kana. All adjectives end in the kana I. And that is the part, and the only part, that changes. With Godan verbs, the uro kana changes to its equivalent in one of the other rows. So, su can become sa, shi, se, or so. And ichidan verbs simply drop the ru. Verbs can also modify into the te form, and again, this is essentially a question of either changing or dropping the final kana and adding te or de. And the same, of course, with ta form. Adjectives can change the I to ku, ka, or ke. So we can have oishiku, oishikatta, or oishikereba. Or we can drop the I altogether and add something else, as for example in oishiso. Nouns, on the other hand, can't modify at all. You can't do anything with the last kana of a noun or any other part of a noun in terms of grammatical modification. But you can add logical particles to a noun, and you can also add the copula da or des to a noun. So we have two sets of words. The yogen, the active words, which you can modify by changing the final kana and adding something, but you can't add logical particles or the copula to these. And nouns, and also pronouns and other noun-like entities, taigen, or static words, which you can't modify, but you can add logical particles or the copula. And it's important to understand that when we add the logical particle or the copula to a noun, we regard those two things joined together as a unit. So, for example, when we add the soft copula na to an adjectival noun, like kirei, we have kireina, and kireina is regarded as a unit in itself. And actually, that unit could be called a na adjective, because kirei plus na or da becomes an adjectival unit. So, although I very much object to the term na-adjective in the way it's used by Western textbooks, which is to say they will tell you that kirei is a na-adjective, and it's not, it's a noun, it's not any kind of an adjective. We could say that kireina or kireida is a na-adjective. I would not recommend it simply because the term is so abused in Western so-called Japanese grammar that it's best left alone. It has a name in Japanese, but since it would take rather a while to explain it, I won't go into that here, but it's not anything like na-adjective. Now the other thing to understand is that when we attach the copula to a noun, that combination is in fact a yogen, or active unit. And that's obvious because once we've attached the copula to it, we can in fact modify it. The copula has a te form, which is de. So, kireina can become kireida in order to conjoin it to something else. We can also modify it. Kireida into, say, kireidata. So, once we attach the copula to a noun, we have a yogen, an active unit, and as I'm sure you'll have already worked out by now, this means that the three engines, the three possible ways of ending a sentence, are all yogen or active units. That's to say, verb, adjective, and noun plus copula. These are the three possible engines of a sentence, and they are also the three possible yogen. We tend to call them yogen when they're modifying something else, when they're inside a sentence. So armed with this information, we can now take a deeper look at the particle de. When I introduced it in the video on logical particles, I said that it, like the other logical particles other than ga, which of course is in every sentence, and no, which is a logical particle, but it doesn't tell us what its noun is doing in relation to the action of the sentence. It tells us about the noun in relation to another noun, but the other particles, including de, I said, were only active in a, does, be sentences. That's verb sentences. Now that is something of an oversimplification. There is another way in which they can act. It doesn't become too much of a problem not knowing that at the beginning, but as we progress, we need to understand this. And in order to understand it, we need to know what we've just learned. We need to know about teigen and yogen, static and active elements. Because the truth is not that de is absolutely restricted to verb sentences, a, does, be sentences, although most of the time it is. What it's restricted to is clauses that modify yogen. And the yogen, as we know, can be a verb, but it can also be an adjective or even an adjectival noun plus copula. And there are some cases where this happens. So what is de actually doing? Well, as we know, there are three positional logical particles, and they are the targeting particle, ni, which tells us where something goes to or where it is, where it stays once it's got there. There is e, which is the directional particle, and there is de. And what de really does is tells us the boundary or limit within which something happens. Usually that's a physical boundary, a physical area, though it doesn't always have to be. So ni tells us where a noun, person, animal, thing is headed to, or where it's located. E tells us the direction in which it's going. De tells us the boundary within which an action or a state of being takes place. It's usually an action, so that's how we introduce it. But it can be a state of being. In other words, it can be an adjectival. So for an example, let's take the phrase, Sekai de ichiban oishii ramen. Now people will ask, why de? Why are we using de in this case? And the answer is that sekai de, remember that we always treat a logical particle plus the noun it's attached to as a unit. Sekai de is defining the limit within which something is happening, but in this case, it's defining the limit within which a state of being applies. So we're talking about the most delicious ramen in the world. The world is the limit we're applying. And in this case, of course, with the world, we're trying to give as big a limit as possible. But we might say, kono machi de ichiban oishii ramen. And then we're saying the most delicious ramen in this town. So we've drawn a boundary around it. We're not saying it's the most delicious ramen possible, but we are saying within certain limits, within the limits of this town, it's the most delicious ramen. So that's what de is doing. Just as with an action, it tells us where the action takes place, the locality, the boundary within which it takes place. With the other kind of yorgen, an adjectival, it's telling us the boundary within which that adjectival quality prevails. Now we can also say sekai no ichiban oishii ramen. That's less commonly said, but it could be said. And what that means is the most delicious ramen of the world. But the point to understand here is that de is drawing the boundaries of the yorgen, the active element, the verb, or in this case the adjective. No is doing something different. We know what no does. It links one noun to another. So it's not modifying the quality of oishii as de is. It's modifying ramen. And because of this, we can also say, kono ramen wa sekai de ichiban oishii. We're saying this ramen is the most delicious in the world. But we can't say, kono ramen wa sekai no ichiban oishii. Why can't we? Because as we know from the lesson on word order, in Japanese, words only modify words that come after them. They can't modify words that come before them. And because no can't modify oishii, it can only modify ramen, which is another noun. And because ramen is on the wrong side of it, we can't actually use that. So we have to say, kono ramen wa sekai de ichiban oishii, because de sets the boundary within which oishii prevails. Now, since we know that a noun plus copula also functions as a yorgen, an active element, we can also say sekai de ichiban yumei na androido. And in this case, sekai de is modifying yumei na. It couldn't modify yumei on its own because yumei is a noun, but it can modify yumei na. So it's telling us the boundaries within which this fame operates. She is the most famous android in the world. She may not be the most famous android in the solar system, but she is the most famous android in the world. Now the same happens when we say something like minna de odoru. We all dance. Why do we say minna de? Well, if we say futari de odoru, we're saying two of us dance. If we say hitori de odoru, we're saying dance alone. The quantitative statement plus de is describing the limits of the people who do it. So, as I said before, the boundary or area or demarcation that de draws for us is usually a physical one, a place. If we say heia de odoru, we're saying I dance in the room. But if we say hitori de odoru, we're saying I dance alone. In both cases, we're drawing a boundary to say what are the limits. The physical limits are the room, and the numerical or quantitative limits are hitori, futari, minna, etc. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere, and I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.